Welcome. Today we will delve into the heart of the hidden life of one of the most enigmatic and controversial dictators, Adolf Hitler, his personal residence in the Bavarian Alps, which appears to be an idyllic sanctuary, but in reality conceals an atmosphere of fear, betrayal, and dependence. What if the image of a genius and brave leader, imposed by official history, is merely a facade, behind which hides a man obsessed with paranoia and drug addiction? Why, inside the ideal residence, as it was presented to the public, did staff members disappear daily? And why was access to Hitler's office strictly prohibited? And furthermore, how in this closed, seemingly peaceful world were decisions about mass murders made, plunging the era into unimaginable chaos and death? The stakes are the truth about what happened behind closed doors, and how history not only documents these events, but also how these secrets could alter our understanding of power itself and its destructive inner world. In this video, we will reveal how the personal life of the dictator and his circle became inextricably linked to the end of an era, and we will try to answer, who was he really? A heroic leader, or a person broken by fear and addiction? Are you ready to uncover the secrets stored in sealed archives and fading into oblivion? Then, let's begin. Deep within the Bavarian Alps, surrounded by picturesque peaks and expansive valleys, stands Berghof, a refuge depicted in official historical chronicles, textbooks, and memorial monuments as a sacred place of power, a symbol of strength and determination. An outsider's view might show an attractive facade of luxurious halls, elegant terraces, and idyllic views of mountain summits, where the common logic suggests that a person who has risen to the level of the absolute leader of a global machine must be a genius, strategist, and enlightener. Behind this facade lies a much more sinister truth. The truth about Berghof is a secret even the most dedicated do not wish to know. It is a hidden side of power saturated with fear, dependency, and internal rebellion. In 1942, amid the height of the global war, a 20-year-old Austrian girl named Elisabeth Karlheimer went to Hitler's residence as a maid. This young woman, driven by poverty and a sincere desire to earn a living, could not have imagined that she was entering a place that had become the center of bloody decisions, foreseen yet concealed from prying eyes. At the time, Berghof seemed like an idol, as it was called in Soviet and Western documents. And indeed, from the outside, luxury, comfort, exquisite interiors, where paintings, sculptures, and antique items mingled, all created to make the seat of power seem timeless and impervious to destruction. Would these illusions have been possible without extraordinary effort to craft an image of calm and stability? Part 2 of 8. In this place, surrounded by natural beauty, a true theatrical performance was taking place. A theater where the roles of genius, leader, and unwavering commander were not only played by his public speeches and films broadcast worldwide, but also embodied within the inner space of Berghof itself. Behind closed doors, another reality unfolded. A darker, more visceral world, filled with fear and hidden secrets. Inside this theater, the actors weren't only soldiers and ministers, but also the staff of the residence, among whom a web of fear and distrust had taken root. This regime, built on propaganda and ideology, had its subtle, almost imperceptible cracks. Beneath the mask of absolute order, disappearances occurred. People working at Berghof would suddenly vanish without explanation. The circles of high-ranking officials or security services were reticent to share facts. Their names were erased from memory, their achievements and mistakes dissolved into legends. An entry to Hitler's office was strictly forbidden. Anyone attempting to break in without permission risked disappearance or, far worse, having their memory erased from those around them. There was also a sense that within these walls lived not a man but a mysterious figure, some kind of monster surrounded by an aura of secrecy, someone whose face was invisible to most, except for a select few. Elisabeth, sitting in her office, could hear whispers, soft conversations behind the walls, reflections of an increasingly tense internal world within the security and administration. She could hear words about preparations for new atrocities, plans that bore no relation to the public image of the Minister of Propaganda or the Führer. Testimonies, often overheard by chance and left unspoken, were sometimes just quiet whispers, barely distinguishable amid the sounds of elliptical music and echoing footsteps in the corridors. It was as if these whispers carried part of a hidden truth that could not be voiced aloud. Hitler was not a hero or a seer, as depicted in official histories. His inner world was a suffocating labyrinth of dependencies, fears, and paranoia that disintegrated his soul from within. His hand, when holding a cup of coffee or a cigarette, trembled, an indicator of his nervous breakdowns and hidden anxieties. Shadows fell over the Führer's face, his eyebrows furrowed and his eyes, tearful yet imbued with madness. He was a man obsessed by fears, fear of assassination, fear of betrayal, fear of losing power. These paranoias shaped every decision he made, every word, every movement. His environment was dictated by law, control over food, supplies, what he read and said. Not a slightest mistake was allowed, no chance of betrayal. Otherwise, death would come swiftly and mercilessly. To truly understand his inner world, one would need to hear the inner dialogues, those whispers behind the closed doors of his office. There, in the silence and shadows, the man who outwardly appeared as an unshakable leader was transforming into a blazing chaos of fear and mistrust. These discussions were difficult to hear because their participants, servants, guards, aides, were tightly controlled, but their shadows and echoes remained. The fear that permeated the air inside the Berghof was not simply a fear of failure, but a deep, all-consuming terror of losing power, at the heart of which was a substance-fueled, cocaine-driven madness and wild dread. Despite the internal tragedy and the paradoxical nature of his personality, on one side an insatiable desire for power, on the other, pathetic dependency and fear, there was another layer inside Berghof. The wife of the man, controlled by his endless whims and secrets. The quiet manager, Eve Braun, whom history often depicts differently in accounts, was not just a housekeeper maintaining order. She was inside, closer to Hitler than anyone else. She was a secret agent, hidden nervous energy, observing every movement, every glance. In her unspoken gestures, in her quiet commands, lay not only the care for the entire household, but also internal surveillance, an inner mindset, an inner circle of insiders, making her an integral element of this complex system. Between this external image and internal reality, there is a central question. Can the constructed image of Hitler as a genius and strategic leader withstand the scrutiny of testimonies from those who were inside, those who witnessed his suffering, dependence, and fear? Can we trust what we hear today? Authoritative accounts from servants and witnesses? Or is it merely part of a carefully crafted disguise, a propaganda construct hiding the true person behind the facade? Today, revealing Hitler's personal life through the eyes of his servants and their testimonies, we arrive at a shocking conclusion. His true persona was not merely his public image. It was a mirror of insurmountable internal conflicts, fears, and dependencies. At the moment when it seemed we knew him as the face on television, in photographs, and in offices, the real story shows us an entirely different picture. This is a man who feared, depended upon, and tried to hide it all behind the facade of a dictator. And within this lies the key to understanding the greatest mystery of the 20th century, a riddle that still provokes overwhelming reflection and confounds those seeking to understand. Who is he really? In the final hours, as the clock hands pointed toward the hopeless point of no return, dramas played out within the Berghof residence that remained beyond human perception. As the Allies approached the Führer as an unavoidable end, the atmosphere in his secluded quarters resembled an explosive, destructive field filled with panic, fear, and a frenetic need for control. In this enclosed space, surrounded by cold cells and strict discipline, a unique cycle of hopelessness developed, fueled by his own internal scream and obsession with power. It was not just a confined existence, it was a fracture of his personal psyche, shaped by an atmosphere of fear and betrayal. It was precisely within this labyrinth, where each day could be his last, that a new reality was formed. The reality that, like transparent glass, reflected the wounded soul of the dictator, immersed in a bottomless abyss of madness and fear. The environment inside the bunker in those final months of the war resembled an extremely tense game, where every word and every movement could have lethal consequences. The crackling of the Primus stove, the sound of broken glass, the quiet whispering through bolts and steel doors, all of this world seemed filled with an invisible threat. Negotiations, which previously took place in a calm setting, now minimized to a bare minimum. Everyone who had access to Hitler felt like they were walking on a minefield. Rumors and gossips spread like fire across snow-covered plains, quickly, dangerously, all-consuming. An air of anxiety hung heavily, becoming more oppressive, entangling secrets that prevented anyone from leaving their role or their duties without fear. It was like a nightmarish haze over the entire residence, where each interlocutor's role was either to betray or to disappear. The Führer himself, abandoned to sharp bouts of rage and pharmaceutical dependence, had become a shadow of the man he once was. Former clarity had vanished. His speech had become incoherent, his voice fragile and explosive. Documents, plans, even his own time, everything was under control, under constant surveillance and inspections that he demanded himself and scrutinized out of fear. This control had become his drug. Hallucinations and fears intertwined with the real destruction visible through the windows and heavy doors. The internal regime was strict, unyielding, without exceptions, without mercy. Anyone daring to show weakness or jest quickly disappeared, vanished into the bottomless prison corridors, where fate could be decided in an instant. In contrast to external chaos, increased isolation, and feverishness, there arose inside Hitler a peculiar, unstable harmony, a mixture of fear, rage, and complete destruction. In his final days of the war, his speech grew increasingly incoherent. Phrases broke off, thoughts became abrupt. Time turned into a frantic kaleidoscope of decisions that seemed irrational, illogical, like he was trying to hold on to the elusive stream of his consciousness on the verge of disappearance. For those around him, he was already a man on the brink of madness, obsessed with the idea of destruction, retaining only a shadow of power that had long since become an illusion. Inside the bunker, he remained the captain of ruin, the captain of a ship falling apart, and his command decisions reflected not only wild persistence, but also a complete rejection of common sense. It is no coincidence that these days, his reckless military decisions seem more like compulsive repetitions than strategic planning. Their foundation was not calculation, but an internal crisis that escalated into paranoia and uncertainty, which guided him toward destruction. Inside the Berghof, there was not only a psychological war, but also confusion that complicated the operation of the entire system. Discussions, whispers, secret meetings, all were permeated with a sense of imminent collapse. Groups of commanders and advisors, who yesterday trusted each other, now bore the cracks of distrust, debating the last options for destroying the camps, final decisions embedding the death of millions. This internal disharmony was transmitted through walls, doors, quiet voices, and even through the confusion and disorientation penetrating every word. Listening to these conversations, one could detect uncertainty, hope for salvation, or, conversely, a hopeless ritual of betrayal. Amid all this loomed an impending catastrophe. It was felt by everyone inside the Berghof as a heavy cloud overhead, hovering over their lives as if a storm was ready to break and swallow everything. Death, the ultimate collapse of an empire that did everything possible to maintain the illusion of absolute control. But this control was not free of cracks. It was a vulnerable facade, threatening to crumble at any moment. The sense of disappearance, not only physical but also psychological, hung in the air. People felt their world was a grain of sand on the edge of an abyss, and the mechanism that kept it balanced was cracking and vibrating. Fear of loss of power, betrayal, and ultimate destruction intertwined with thoughts of death. This emotional storm, this mixture of rage and despair, was not merely internal anguish, but ultimately the core from which the last act of this dramatic performance was forged. The main question that involuntarily arises when analyzing the internal life of the Berghof in these last days is, how did internal fear and constant control influence Hitler's behavior and that of his circle? How did the atmosphere of fear imposed by the regime shape their decisions, their actions, their final choices? Was it truly this atmosphere, so closely linked with betrayal, danger, and dependence, that ultimately became their companion in madness and demise? Could it serve as a beacon guiding them towards self-destruction? The dictator's inner world is a labyrinth of paranoia and dependence, built from the fear of losing control and the desire to preserve the illusion of power at any cost. This microscopic world, calm amid chaos, proved to be a paradox. The more he fought for power, the faster it slipped from his grasp. The connection between this inner world and the escape from ultimate reality is the true essence of this tragedy. And perhaps it is precisely through this psychological tangle that the secret of his downfall is revealed. A regime seemingly created to reinforce authority turned out to be the weapon of his own self-destruction. This regime was not only a system, but a trap in which everyone involved was ensnared, and ultimately, each of them turned out not to be the enemies of the regime, but its victims. In the final weeks, days, and hours of Berghof's existence, symbol of Nazi power, its firm and ominous residence, something happened that was not only the end of an era, but also a visit to the darkest corner of the human soul. Amid this chaos, in a state of complete disillusionment and false notions of inviolability of authority, a dramatic story unfolded, revealing the true face of Hitler, his inner world, suppressed dependency, paranoia, and absolute destruction, his own identity swallowed up. Let us recall those days when Berghof, this fortress of ideology and brutal power, became a theater of unbalanced, erupting chaos. The last month of the war was a time when the shadow of death loomed over every brick, every chimney, and every survivor. In the turmoil of events, when plans had long since been shattered, and resistance was only a faint echo inherited from the past, all meetings disappeared. People who had recently waved flags and followed orders were gone. Nazi leaders, once linked to the ship of power, vanished into the shadows, as if dissolving into the air, leaving behind only traces of their disappearance. Faces cloaked in masks of secrecy and fear. Some may have tried to emulate heroes, but within each, anxiety was taking root. At this moment, when enemies were already storming the gates and the remnants of their army were on the brink of extinction, Hitler was alone in his residence, surrounded by ruins and fear. His face, already worn from chronic ailments and constant stress, seemed powerless. Yet at the same time, it appeared to be imbued with inner resolve. He refused to trust anyone, no matter how hard someone from his circle tried to explain that fleeing or surrendering was the only way out. All decisions now were made solely by him. Only his hand could steer the wheel of fate, and that hand, seemingly withered, still clung to the last fragile mechanism of power. During intense air raids, pouring down with relentless force on Berghof, recalling the ruthless bombings of the final days, it became clear Hitler was renouncing all aid, relying solely on the strength of his mind and his own decisions. His health had, in essence, plummeted to a critical level. His face turned pale, his eyes dark and deeply sunken, as if internally he had already turned into ashes, confusion, and an abyss. In this era, when even his most loyal associates did not know how he could be saved or stopped, he seemed to have stopped seeing others altogether. Only his own images, phantoms of his ideas, in which he continued to hide, retreating behind a curtain of illusion. Meanwhile, within the residence itself, an invisible but very noticeable chaos was unfolding. Staff members were disappearing. There were no explanations, no reports about his fate. People who previously filled Berghof with life and orders vanished one by one, as if dissolving into the air. These disappearances were clear evidence, a deep, irreversible preparatory stage for the final collapse. No one commented on their vanishing. Only a silent, dead silence, saturated with fear and hopelessness. Testimonies of how they left, how they were never seen again. These were not merely accounts of escape or fear. They signaled the end from within, proof that the system built on cruelty had long since crumbled internally. Time was running out, and this period was aptly called an era of immersion into darkness, when every movement became an increasingly rehearsed act. During the night from April 30th to the early hours of May 1st, when all possibilities seemed exhausted, Hitler, having completely lost hope, made a decision that would mark the very end of his power and his life. At that moment, in a dark room lit faintly by a lamp, he sat, unseen by those around him, deep in thought. The silence was only broken by his heavy breathing, a lost voice whispering as if he himself didn't believe these words, his last to be spoken. He, a man whose soul was filled with paranoia, fear, and a thirst for power, was now retreating into an underground bunker, seemingly out of terror in the face of reality. His vast residence, Berghof, became ruins. Halls that once echoed with orders of genocide were transformed into empty, destroyed spaces. The clatter of blows on the walls, the hum of devastation, all seemed to highlight that the seemingly invulnerable regime had finally collapsed. Or more precisely, he had left behind only the ruins of physical walls and sinister illusions. What was happening inside Hitler during these final days? His speech became muddled, incoherent, words slipping away like loose sand, failing to form a whole. Only furious shouts, flashes of rage, and mad manic outbursts remained. It was not political chaos, but an inner collapse of the soul. His gaze, once coldly calculating and resolutely firm, became frenzied, pounding as if his mind was teetering on the edge of madness. He seemed to have lost control over his own worldview, his surrounding world, dismantled, fragile, collapsing. In this state, he began to speak of betrayal, of a conspirator within his circle, as if he were crying out his last illusions. His rage was not so much defiance against enemies, but a way to resist the old self, a self dying along with Berghof. What feelings overwhelmed Elizabeth, the woman who had long been witnessing all this? After the final destruction, after the last line was crossed, she, grown stronger, slightly wounded from Izhevsk, left the destroyed residence. Her heart was filled with heaviness. She understood that she had witnessed not just a historical moment, the end of the German Nazi system, but an internal disintegration, what had been hidden behind the facade of power. She had seen them broken, both Hitler and his entourage, but it was his internal crisis that opened her eyes to the full extent of the horror embedded within this system. Her memory retained the images of halls turning into ruins and walls reduced to ashes. But physical destruction was not the only aspect that mattered. In those wreckage, she uncovered the truth. Inside this man, increasingly filled with paranoia and fury, there was nothing left, not even remnants of his power, only a handful of shards from his soulless authority. The years went by, turning into decades. For her, an elderly woman just beyond a century of life, a final desire, necessity, emerged to tell the world the truth. What was Hitler's face like in these last years of his life? Not mythic, not heroic, but real, stern, and hideous. The testimony she was about to share was not about glory or heroic resistance, but about a person, paranoid, dependent, utterly destroyed by his own fears and illusions. His personality was not a monument, but ruins, not a triumph, but rot. These facts prove Hitler, along with his entire system, was not an invincible machine, but a castle of sand, sustained only by a mask, which collapsed under its own weight. This inner world, hidden behind the dictator's words and gestures, is the key to understanding his complete downfall. And it is precisely this account, the most precise and unadorned portrait of this man, that is not only a remembrance of an era, but also a proof of how an abyss constantly roared within his heart, which in a single moment swallowed him and his regime. Lies, cunning, and artificial illusions, all of these shadows of a collapsing power were swept away. Only the raw, unvarnished face of a person remained, who mercilessly self-destructed, leaving behind ruins and terror. Uncovering this truth is not just about revisiting facts. It's the key to understanding that even the mightiest systems, even those that seemed invulnerable, are ultimately illusions, lies, and destruction. And that internal emptiness can swallow all external walls, leaving only an indelible mark of fear and horror.